So there's a
And
couple
then,
of nuggets in there I want to
yeah,
just pause on for a second.
absolutely.
So, what's interesting is what you just said is risk, right? So being able to kind of be public about something. So the minute you
Hmm.
are being public or announcing, there's a risk that comes with how that's going to be received, right?
Right.
And I think I said this to you, and we may have talked about this in my previous interview. So when I did my research, the one thing that helped, particularly women, and we see this very much more common in men than it is with women, just so you know, people who take risks actually do much better. Like they move up the ladder much faster because they take these risks. So what you just talked about was risk, you becoming vulnerable, right? Brené Brown talks about courage and risk and vulnerability all the time. So I thought it was really interesting that what you just described and that example of Don Draper was like, that's a huge risk. It could go
Yes.
either way, but but nine times out of 10, you won't know till you try. But it also ties to something I want to talk to you about later, which is the moral compass that we have. The other thing and sort of this is sort of the other side to something that you mentioned, which was the stepping up. You talked about people stepping up and there's opportunity. What happens to somebody if, so I'm a person, you've kind of figured out already, that when I'll step up. And that's been my whole life. I mean, there's a vacuum someplace or someone's not willing to try something and I think we should do it. I don't care. I'll try. The worst that will happen is it doesn't go exactly as we thought, but it's good. If I'm confident enough to believe that if I have a role in it, it's going to go okay. It can go great if I get more people on board, but worst case, it will go okay. Do I think anything's going to tank? Rarely. That's not the mindset I go into, but yeah. And so maybe I'm a bit foolish that way, but I generally feel like if I think that something's on the right track, I don't go in like blindly, but I will step up. But what happens to the people? There are people in this world that have imposter syndrome or don't have enough self confidence and may never really step up.
So this is why I suggest that it can start quite humbly, okay? But also, this is a key part of the hero's journey, which is that third chapter, which is refusal of the call. You see that somebody should do something, and
Yeah.
it's still in your mind somebody. It's not you. You don't feel like you have the capacity to do it, and that is one of the reasons that mentorship is so important. It could be in the form of coaching. It could be taking a course. You can't necessarily rely on encountering a mentor exactly when you need. We talked about lean in as a concept, but the lean in idea comes from the book Lean In. And Sheryl Sandberg said in her book something along the lines of waiting for a mentor is like waiting for Prince Charming. You know, you can't count on it. And so you have to cobble together your own mentorship,
Yeah.
and so that you can assemble the information you need, but at the end you have to really just sort of analyze what are the risks, pros and cons. What if nobody does anything? How bad
Yeah.
would that be? If I do something, how bad, and it fails, how bad would that be? The other thing is you can mitigate the failure. Don Draper had been an advertising executive for 10 years and was doing quite well when he made that announcement. It was also a measured risk, because even if you offend the tobacco base of your client,
Yeah.
the tobacco part of your client base, you are actually in a way complementing the remainder of your client base by saying we have high moral standards and we're with you. So it was a measured risk, but it was also a risk taken at a time in his career when he could do a grand gesture. If you
Yeah.
can't do a
Yeah.
grand gesture at first, then one of the things you can do is go straight to the people who are most likely to ally with you. The people who see what you want to do and see the value in it, they may have the capacity to create the support you need to get started. So you can kind of cobble together mentorship by seeking allies early.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like that approach a lot. It's funny, like, I always think about what holds people back.
Mm-hmm.
And then, usually I talk about what I call fear or false evidence appearing real, or the story we tell ourselves, or
Yes.
the story we should be telling ourselves. But I do think you talked about the mentorship piece, but I also think it's also important to talk about a coach, having a good coach, not just like there's so many coaches in the world and people, and you have to find someone that resonates with you.
Mm-hmm.
But my style is not like, so tell me, and I'm like, uh-huh, uh-huh. I'm going to push you because I
Yeah.
believe for you to grow, I'm not going to make you like feel horrible. I mean, people who have coached would tell you they really, they see growth in themselves, but you can't grow unless you have someone who's saying, is this what you think you should be doing? What are the options? And really walking you through, like helping you clear clear the mess, the chaos to get the clarity that you're looking for. And I think mentors are great for that. But if you can't find a mentor, I think short term, I mean, mentors are fantastic, but also champions. But if you can't find those people, I think people should be thinking about, do you hire a coach? And you don't need to coach for, you know, it's not like therapy where you should have them for 30 years or 20 years. You just, I tell people, I'm not here to be your therapist. I work with you 5 sessions, maybe 10, but you'll see significant growth and hopefully you'll fly. And then you can come back every once in a while when you need a check in. But that's what I think sometimes that's equally good because then you have somebody who's invested in your well-being but is not clouded by your personal relationship. And I think that's the other thing when we think about mentors, they they're friendly but they're not your best friends, right? That's not who
Right.
you want. You want someone who's going to be very honest with you about, I think this is great, or I think this is missing, or I think this is what you should be thinking about, because I think
Yeah.
all those things help you get through that journey. Sorry.
The idealized mentor is sort of taking you under their wing, and it is a personal relationship, almost a maternal or paternal relationship. Which the challenge with that is that you're almost being shown this is the lottery ticket I used to win. It doesn't help you. It
Yeah.
shows you what they did, and it might get you started.
Yeah.
But whereas a coach has seen people in your situation over and over and over and sees the patterns, it's not just one
Yes.
pattern that they're trying to impart. They're seeing that pattern from multiple examples.
It's so funny. You again, I'm telling you, this is amazing to me. Like you keep resonating because, I've been on panels or I've been invited to sort of sit in. And people say, well, just tell us about your story. And I'm always a bit hesitant. That's not my favorite way to do things. And I tell people that in advance, partially because my story is mine. And as interesting as it might be to me and maybe a couple of people, I prefer doing more like a workshop where I can give you some tools, or if I share with you a story, but I hope then here's the takeaway that you should apply rather than this was my journey, because my journey is very unique to me. Highly unlikely someone else is going to have it. There may be bits and pieces that resonate, but my hope is that when someone listens to my story or your story, Tim, they're going to think, okay, well, that resonated. How did you deal with that? And what in hindsight, what would you have done differently? And what are the lessons learned? Which is exactly what you just said. And that's the nugget, not this was my story and this is how I got here, which is fantastic, but hardly anyone's going to have the same story. So I want to go back to something that really struck me when I was reading your book, which I absolutely, absolutely loved. It was one of the best things in the. So you had so many analogies, movie references, fantastic quotes, and very relatable. So I could visualize them. I think I said to you, it's a very visual book for me. And often you picked characters that were really challenged, right? So what struck me was they would often rise to the occasion, which is what you talk about. And I know that's why you picked them. But what was interesting was they would rise to the occasion when their moral compass was a bit in question. Like they were working in a place where they didn't necessarily agree with those decisions and kind of went a different direction to align with their purpose or moral compass. And then sometimes they were just the underdog, and
Mhm.
so kind of what was going through my mind was this doesn't always happen in a corporate setting. Like can you challenge if you're in a hierarchical system, the status quo? How does that work? And then, for me, it resonated because I think I kind of have in my entire life in a way, but I figured out how to navigate that. But that's a lot harder for people. Are we mostly underdogs? Is that how you see it? Like I sort of wondered a little bit about, is that how you saw yourself? Or
Right.
and do you see most of us as underdogs? How, like, in terms of how you structured it, that sort of, and the analogies that you used.
Well, thank you. So the question of whether a hero's journey always has to be in the face of an outrage or complete odds against you, and whether that relates to what goes on in a corporation, I can sort of see that what you're getting at is a disconnect. But I will say that there are often occasions where corporations go awry morally.
Yeah.
Dieselgate, the Pinto thing at Ford, some of the things that happened at Exxon. That there are occasions where if somebody had stepped forward more forcefully, if they had crossed the threshold, could have caused better outcomes for the company and better
Yeah.
outcomes for the world at large.
What do you think in the journey, when we think about that journey and sort of all the steps that you talked about? Where, in which stage do you think is the sort of least or most misunderstood or underestimated in your mind? And why do you think that's the case?
So I think when we look at somebody who we admire, who's accomplished something that we think is valuable, we are often looking at, again, we're looking at the middle, the second act, more than the beginning and the end. And so we're looking at the ordeal, the time that it takes to get all the people together to join you, the experimentation you do, the planning, that time that you
Mm.
really hunker down and get it done. And then at that moment where you declare the victory. So you go through that stage, and that's what we tend to see um, described. When somebody's interviewed, how did you get this done? They go through that part of the journey. They don't go through
Yeah.
the whole dark night of the soul where they try to figure out what it is they want to do and how they're going to do it
Yeah.
and cobble together the resources to start. But
Yeah.
also, just as importantly, I think in some ways more importantly, we don't see the aftermath, especially in movies. Movies often end at the end when
Yeah.
the victory is won, and that's it.
Yes.
You get in
Yes.
the helicopter and you leave the smoking hole, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But there's no aftermath. What happened after you vanquished the alien? How do you protect the earth from this happening again? How do you deal with your own regrets, the loss of the
Yes.
people?
Yeah.
How do you recuperate? How do you
Yes.
reset your priorities? And then also, how do you help people around you given your new experience? So that whole part of the movie is missing. I
So
talk a
true.
lot about the movie The Hunt for Red October, which I love. The book
Why
The
do you
Hunt.
love that so much?
So the reason I love first of all, how could you not? I don't know if you've seen it, but it's got Alec Baldwin, Sean Connery, James Earl Jones.
Yeah.
It's a very technical movie, so I'm into that technical mumbo jumbo of how things
Yeah.
really operate. It shows you a secret world that I knew nothing about, which is how submarine warfare is conducted.
Yeah.
But the thing I liked about it the most, and I've been saying this for over 15 years, because I first met my girlfriend 15 years ago, and I forced her to watch it. And I said, look, the thing about this movie is there's no bad guys. Everybody in that movie is acting extremely capably. It's only two people who are really breaking the rules of their own organization, and they are the heroes, and they are the two people who prevent a situation unraveling that could have caused Armageddon. I mean, talk about high stakes, right? But it
Yeah.
took
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
people who are not just capable, who are not just professional, but are willing to break the rules to make new rules.
Right.
I
Right.
didn't realize how profound that was at the time. I just thought that's really cool. Like that's unique for a movie. There would be no bad guys. But now I can see that highlights the importance of a hero as somebody who can see the current circumstances, the current rules, the current regulations. They don't serve us anymore. We need to make a change. So it really did inform the book in many ways. Like there are many scenes when I watch the movie again now. Like, oh
Yeah.
my God, that perfectly illustrates the call to adventure. Oh my God,
I'm
that
gonna watch
perfectly
it
illustrates.
again now because of
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
But you know what? But you just described was also really innovation, right?
Mhm.
Like if this is the framework and we're operating within it, and then people saying not just, but is that we're going to push the boundaries of what we think we know because there's precedent,
Yep.
right? And then there's, okay, this is not going to work. And so there's the complexity of the stories that you described from that movie is there's the moral compass piece, there's the risk taking piece, there's the not following the rules piece, which I don't know what that means for me, but I think this I'm making decisions on my own in the middle of nowhere with one other person, right? And then the ramifications of all the willing to step up and hoping for the good outcome that you're looking for. And then, but there's alignment in sort of something better than myself at the end of the
Mhm.
day, right? And so
Yeah.
that actually is talking about when we talk about purpose, when we talk about even things like leadership and executive leadership, those are all the things that you are really talking about with those characters in many ways. It's just that maybe they found their backbone or whatever you want to call it, and maybe they were forced, maybe they already had it, but it is very interesting. And it's interesting that you said like there's no bad guys. Like it's not
Mhm.
like right, it was not so evident. So anyway, I'm gonna go back and rewatch it, but I thought it was such an interesting you kept referring to it. And I thought, I think I remember that piece because I'd seen it, of course, years ago. And yeah, I remember that. And then I thought, I wonder why he likes the book so much, the movie
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah. I mean, I should warn people, spoiler alerts, but I mean, it's like almost a 40-year-old movie, but it really stands up. One of the things about
It's a
movies made
classic.
in that age is it was all physical special effects. Like they would actually have a little boat in the bathtub and show you. And so it stands up. Like it doesn't, how nowadays you see a 20-year-old movie and the
Yeah.
CGI is terrible. There's
Yeah.
none of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So I want to just pivot a little bit because you talk a lot about the elixir, returning with the elixir. So what does that look like in a real organization in your mind? And maybe just talk a little bit about that is for people.
That's the part of what I think many movies omit. They don't get that far. They get to the happy ending and that's it.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, and the thing is that having gone through that journey, you have come to a far greater understanding of
Yeah,
the world and the people around you, and even your own
yeah,
capabilities.
yeah,
And that is the elixir. And how you share the elixir really takes two forms. You can say, "This is the lesson I learned from this adventure. It will help us deal with future adventures of similar scope and scale. And here's how we do it." Or it could be even more fundamental, which is, "Look, I figured out that it is possible to make change in the world, and I'm going to help people around me make those changes." So you become a kind of official mentor to the people around you, that people can come to you and say, "I want to make this change." That doesn't mean you automatically say, "Yeah, let's run with it," but you create the conditions for their success. You say, "All right, for that change to happen, list the things that are going to have to take place. And what are the odds of those things? Can you get these resources?" So you can walk them through what it takes basically to do the hero's journey, to understand what's ahead of them, all the hurdles they haven't necessarily already considered. You can help them over, but you can also help them anticipate.
So it's interesting when you were talking. This is what I wrote down. So I wrote down postmortem, a little
Mm-hmm.
bit of like we don't do enough of that to say, okay, what have we learned from this and whatever, how we can do differently. But then what I also heard you say is it's important to share the impact. It's important to have some reflection on, not only the journey, but the ups and the downs and the lessons learned and what not to do again and what can we impart on people. And then how all of that informs our go forward strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And then a little bit on the rebuild to
A
some
little
degree.
bit on
Because
the
when you talk,
rebuild.
yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that one other thing is that depending on how aggressive your goal was in the beginning, you may find that there's a quote by John F. Kennedy when he was talking about the moon mission, and he said, "We are going to put a man on the moon and bring him safely home, and we do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard and they test our mettle." And there's a joke in the programming community, we do these things because we thought they would be easier than they turned out to be, right? And that is often what happens is we get trapped by our promises, to assemble alliances, to fend off the opponents. We say, "Oh, it'll be easy and it'll be amazing." And that's often not the case. We exaggerate the positive and kind of try to hide the negative. And so when we go to implement, this is why I think projects always become late and over
Yeah,
budget, is because we've made crazy promises just to get the thing started.
yeah,
And that
yeah.
creates the conditions for an ordeal that sometimes we violate our values during. That we push people harder than we normally would. We back down on our commitments. We maybe don't treat people very well, so that there are moments where our own values are challenged. And so one of the things that at the end
Mm,
of any one of these journeys, we have to reflect on not just what we accomplished and what the hurdles were, but also who we discovered in ourselves.
yeah, that's so interesting. You're talking, I got a flashback. I got a flashback to an interview I had. Oh my God. I think it would have been 2010. And it was for a job, a very senior leadership role. And it was the headhunter who said, tell me about something that went terribly wrong. And I got stuck because I thought, I don't think anything's ever done I've taken care of has ever gone like the word was terribly. Terribly meant it could
Mm-hmm.
not be, it
Yeah.
could not be recovered, right? In my mind, I was like, and then she said, your problem is you see the world through rose-colored glasses. And I thought, oh, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if that's true. But I
Yeah.
remember sort of getting very upset with myself as, after the interview was over. I mean, I did, by the way, I did make it and got the job, but I just remember thinking after that, like, why
You
could
need a
I not?
story.
But I couldn't think
Yeah.
of one. And I
Mm-hmm.
think part of that was, it goes back to some things that you talked about, which is I mean, whether I actually had a Gantt chart or not, there was one in my head, built in the buffer. I was in a senior role. I, reported to the vice president and dotted to the president. So the room for error was so I always had like a plan A, plan B, and I was jokingly say I used to be a girl guide, so always prepared kind of thing. So I never really thought about not having that. So when she asked me that question, I was like, I didn't have an answer. So I do think it's so important for us to think about the impact of strategy, the lessons learned, and then what does that mean? And I think also what I heard you say is it's the planning. Like if you're planning appropriately and you kind of put that in, using your analogy of like people who are in programming, like, oh, it looks easier. Yeah, because there's so many other pieces that could go wrong in terms of software, in terms of like just getting it and how functionality, the user, you could write the best stuff in the world, but if the user experience is crap, no one's going to use what you built, right? So it's all of these things. So I think but for me, when as soon as you said that, I thought, oh my God, I had one of those moments.
Yeah. Well, I want to throw something in there. You reminded me of a line from, I don't know if you've seen this movie, but Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie, Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
Yeah, yeah, a long
Yeah,
time ago.
it's a fun movie. And there's a line in it where she says to him, a happy ending is just a story that hasn't ended yet.
Ah,
But what you're saying, I think the reason you have a hard time finding an example of something that went horribly wrong is because you never let it end there, right?
yeah. Oh, wow.
Part of the hero's response to failure is finding another way.
Wait, I'm gonna sit with that for a second. Say that again. So it's because you think that. Say that again. Because you
So
think that I.
you don't let the ending be on a sour note.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's true.
we failed with this effort, but we're not giving up on what we're trying to achieve. We'll find another way. We'll do it
Yes.
differently. We'll regroup. We'll learn from that. Even if
Yeah.
we fail completely and never try again, we've learned something valuable. It's not
That
a
is,
disaster.
yes, I would say that is definitely a good description of how, like, my mindset, my approach is like, okay, what is that experience? If life gives you lemons, you make
Lemons.
lemonades. Yeah. So
Exactly.
you're
Yeah.
you're right. I go in and even things are not exactly ideal. I either figure out what I can navigate to improve the conditions or the situation and the outcome, or I figure out even if it's like the most horrible thing. Like I
And
think
that's
I go
why
in,
And that's why I think it's important to say that if you don't have a lot of experience trying to do new things, do something small new, do that birthday party or whatever,
yeah,
because the
yeah,
stakes of failure are low enough that you can afford to be philosophical about it, that you can afford to make lemonade. You're not,
yeah.
it's like when you go to the casino, which I don't, but they always say bet small, bet small, bet small, and then eventually you can ramp up because you can
Yeah,
afford based on your what you have, but you don't ante up with everything. So like the Don Draper thing, that was a huge ante he did. He pushed
yeah,
a lot of chips into the center of the table, but he had a lot of chips. And there were a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
chips to the side. He could afford to
yeah.
take that risk.
Well, that analogy makes me reminds me that you're actually betting on yourself, right? So it's not a
It's true
casino.
too.
You're
Yeah.
you're you're bet yes, you're betting on yourself. So if you can believe in who you are and you know who you are at the core, then there's a good
Yeah.
chance you're going to come out on top somehow.